All right, we left off with the New Deal programs from the first and second New Deal in the last lesson, and now we're moving on to excuse me, we're moving on to part three of lesson 9 related to the Great Depression, and we continue here with the Dust Bowl, one of the worst geological natural disasters in American history. After the drought of 1933, furious winds whipped up dust into the air, turning parts of Missouri, Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma into the Dust Bowl, and forcing many farmers to migrate west to California. This event helped inspire John Steinbeck's classic, The Grapes of Wrath. The dust was very hazardous to people's health and well being, which created further misery for farmers who were destitute, foreclosing on their land, and their families were starving and being split apart in the Great Plains and in the Midwest. This led to a massive migration farther west or to the east. These migrant farmers became known as Okies or Exodusters. And one of the best books written on the topic was The Worst Hard Time, The Untold Story of Those Who Survived the Great American Dust Bowl by Timothy Egan. It's well worth your time. So here we have image of just how high the dust drifts got in the Midwest. This is Dorothea Lange's migrant mother, famous photo of a migrant family that was displaced during the Dust Bowl. So FDR is going to be challenged by Alfred M. Landon in the presidential election of 1936. The Republicans nominated Kansas Governor Alfred M. Landon to run against FDR. Landon was weak on the radio and even weaker in personal campaigning, criticized FDR's spending, but he also favored enough of FDR's New Deal and New Deal programs that he was ridiculed by the Democrats as an unsure and unprepared crank during the election and during campaigning. In 1934, the American Liberty League was formed by conservative Democrats and wealthy Republicans to fight against the socialistic New Deal programs. Roosevelt won in a huge landslide, getting 523 electoral votes to just 8 of Landon's. FDR won primarily because he appealed to the forgotten man, whom he never forgot and was able to connect with through the fireside chats. But keep in mind, a lot of the New Deal programs had helped people get back to work, get back on their feet, and helped restore a sense of dignity. Here we have FDR and Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau, who we'll talk more about as we head into World War II. FDR's most controversial event was the court packing scheme that occurred during his presidency. FDR had control over Congress in both of his first 2 terms, but the Supreme Court kept blocking a lot of his programs. So he proposed a shocking plan that would add a member to the Supreme Court for every existing member over the age of 70. This was a potential total of 15 members on the court, which was just too far of a reach. Congress voted against FDR, and it was not popular with the general public. Roosevelt was ripped for trying to become a dictator and abusing the power of the executive branch, and most sacred, the checks and balances and the rights provided to the Supreme Court in Article 3 of the Constitution. And clearly, nowhere in Article 2 of the Constitution did it allow the president to add more members of the Supreme Court. FDR's court packing scheme failed, and he did get some justices to start to move his way. One in particular was Owen J. Roberts, who was formerly regarded as a conservative with judiciary restraint or judicial restraint. But, again, FDR got his way with a lot of the New Deal programs, but historians still criticize his failed attempt to pack the courts. FDR's failure in the court packing scheme showed Americans did not want to tamper with the sacred American justice system and obviously the sacred Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. This is a political cartoon. It's pretty funny. It shows Congress, FDR, and it has members of the Supreme Court. And then the new members of the court are 6 FDRs behind the 9 justices. New Deal for Labor. A rash of walkouts and strikes occurred in the summer of 1934, and after the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, was axed, the Wagner Act, also known as the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, took its place. The Wagner Act guaranteed the rights of unions to organize and to collectively bargain with management, which we talked about in toward the end of the last part of the lecture. John L. Lewis, the boss of the United Miners Workers Union, or the United Mine Workers, succeeded in forming the Committee for Industrial Organization, or the CIO, within the ranks of the AFL in 1935, which was a pretty big movement in American history for labor. The CIO later left the AFL, or the AFL, and won a victory against General Motors. The two would eventually merge again in 1955. The CIO also won a victory against the U.S. Steel Corporation, but smaller steel companies struck back, resulting in a number of different incidences. The most violent was the Memorial Day Massacre of 1937 at the plant of the Republic Steel Company in South Chicago, in which police fired upon workers, leaving scores of steel workers killed and or injured. New Deal for Labor concluded in 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Act, also known as the Wages and Hours Bill, was passed, setting up the minimum wage and maximum hour standards, and it also forbade children under the age of 16 from working. This is where we start to see the entry of children having work permits. Very important portion of the second New Deal, which we discussed in the last lesson. And again, that was the second round of the New Deal programs. Roosevelt enjoyed immense support from the labor unions in the second term, and in 1938, the CIA completely broke with the AFL, and again, they'll merge together again after World War II in 1955. This is a scene from the Memorial Day Massacre in 1937 between Chicago police officers and steel workers in South Chicago. There's a new visibility for women during this era, during the FDR era. Ballots now in hand, women took on new roles in society, now having the right to vote. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was arguably the most visible woman in this era, a woman who supported public education, social welfare. She was a humanitarian, a philanthropist. She set the precedent for future first ladies. Another cause that she was got behind was FDR's March of Dimes. Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins was the first female cabinet member in United States history. She served in all of FDR's terms as president. She pushed for the Fair Labor Standards Act that allowed for the minimum wage and the strengthening of child labor laws. Mary McLeod Bethune headed the Office of Minority Affairs in the National Youth Administration, known as the NYA. She was also the leader and the founder of the Black Cabinet. This was the group of African American advisors to Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was a first in American history. And then she also would later become the founder of Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona, Florida, which is a historically black college and university here in the United States. Anthropologist Ruth Benedict, excuse me, helped develop the culture and personality movement, and her student Margaret Mead reached even greater heights with the book Coming of Age in Samoa. These two women, both PhDs from Columbia, inspired the next women's rights movement in the post-World War II era. And then finally, Pearl S. Buck. Sorry, my throat, got to get a drink of water here. Pearl S. Buck, roots not far from us. She was born just outside of Gat Mills, West Virginia. She wrote a beautiful and timeless novel, The Good Earth, about a simple Chinese farmer, which earned her the Pulitzer in 1932 and the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938. She was inspired by her parents who had served as missionaries in China, and she too had spent a time overseas with mission work. So here we have Eleanor Roosevelt on the left, Frances Perkins in the center, and Mary McLeod Bethune there on the right. So what was the legacy of the first and second New Deal? During Roosevelt's first term, the Depression did not disappear. The New Deal only dropped unemployment by about 10%. It was down from 25 to 15% by the time Roosevelt had served his first two terms. Note, World War II really took care of unemployment and dropped unemployment below 3%. In 1937, the economy took another downturn when the Roosevelt recession was caused by a number of FDR's policies. Do keep in mind, FDR embraced the policy of Keynesian economics that was laid out by British economist John Maynard Keynes. The Keynesian theory in macroeconomics is what is called pump priming, right? Where it encourages government spending to help create consumer spending. And then what that would ultimately do is get the economy rolling. So when you print more money, well, that's a pump priming inflationary tactic that can be pretty dangerous, and it can lead to, it can cause recession. So FDR announced a bold program to stimulate the economy by planned deficit spending with the use of inflationary tactics in the short run. This is not anything that's new to us. We've lived through stimulus packages, and we will continue to live through stimulus packages. They're not always popular, but they sometimes are quite necessary because the U.S. market and the global market is so large that it, we want it to correct itself and readjust, but sometimes the marketplace has to be infused with cash to get the economy rolling. Foes of the New Deal condemned the waste in many programs, citing that nothing had been accomplished. And there were a lot of foes to Keynesian economics. There still are. I mean, a lot of people are hell-bent against pump priming and inflationary tactics in times of financial panic. Great example would be the housing crisis in the early 2000s in the United States that led to a global market collapse. Critics were shocked by the try-anything attitude of FDR, who had increased the federal debt from over 19 million in 1932 to over 40 million in 1939. So here we have the pump priming, the idea that the government prints more money, that goes to consumers, consumers put the money in the economy, and it comes back to the government, and this cyclical flow gets the economy rolling and stimulated again. And here we have John Maynard Keynes here on the right. Legacy of the New Deal continued. Took World War II to really lower unemployment. 11 million people enlisted in the armed forces and went to work for the war effort when America was pulled into the war in after December 7th, 1941. But honestly, that started as early as 1939 and 1940 with the start of World War II after the German invasion of Poland, and then in 1940, America is going to move toward a peacetime draft. So we started mobilizing for war before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which put a lot of people to work. The war also created a heavier debt than before, and we're going to deal with that as we move forward. Champions of the cause, aka the New Dealers, claimed that the New Deal had alleviated the worst of the Great Depression and had provided bold reform without a revolution, i.e., a Bolshevik revolution like what we saw occur in the Soviet Union during World War I. Again, the New Dealers also pointed to the fact that this was a restoration of dignity for Americans. Ironically, historians still argue that FDR may have saved the American system of free enterprise, American capitalism, by creating a number of socialistic programs that put Americans to work. Yet many business tycoons despised him, and a lot of conservative historians and economists to this day still don't completely buy in to the success of FDR's New Deal policies. FDR's legacy does not end with the New Deal. He would guide the nation through a titanic war in which the democracy of the world would be at stake. And here's a famous mural, The New Deal, by Conrad A. Albrizio. All right. Please let me know if you all have any questions. Have a great day.